Welcome to a new episode of the CIRAN podcast, reconciling two societal needs, resource extraction and nature conservation. We are Anita Stein and
Luís Rosendo.
And together with our invited experts, we are exploring how Europe balances resource extraction and nature conservation during the energy and environmental transitions. CIRAN is more than a podcast. It's a project funded by the European Union. Today's focus is on collaboration and international cooperation. Critical raw materials are essential for the green energy transition, but their extraction and processing often involve complex global supply chains. International cooperation is therefore crucial to ensure a stable and sustainable supply of these materials. And no one is better positioned to talk about this topic than today's guest, Ludivine Wouters. Ludivine is the managing partner at Latitude Five, where she leads the mining and minerals practice and advises companies and investors on strategy, governance, and policy in natural resources. She also supports states with mining policy, governance, and taxation, and assists donor agencies and stakeholders with the definition of responsible sourcing priorities.
Ludivine, thank you so much for joining us. From your privileged position, how does your experience shape your perspective on collaboration and international cooperation in the field of critical raw materials?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. I think one of the most striking things about the criticality narrative is that because it's based on the notion of scarcity and competition, we actually tend to forget that there has been collaboration and international cooperation on minerals for a very long time. And we tend to forget that it's actually a key pillar and an essential component of addressing the criticality that is leading a lot of the discussion today. So two of the things that I find important to note in this regard. The first one is that a lot of institutions or donors have repositioned around critical minerals in a way that they leverage their experience and their positions, which they'd had for quite a long time, and at the same time re-gear them towards what's really needed to foster responsible and sustainable mineral value chains in the context of the energy transition. What do I mean by that? For example, if you pay attention to the work of USAID in 2020, 2021 put a lot of work into rethinking the challenges and opportunities to engage in the mining sector beyond what it had previously focused on, and to take a holistic view of how it could cooperate with partner countries, how it could foster positive developments in the mining and minerals sector. One example and one outcome is the Jet Minerals Challenge, which focuses on fostering innovative anti-corruption solutions in critical or transition critical mineral value chains. Another example is GIZ. GIZ has been doing a lot of cooperation in mineral-rich countries, and very successfully so, on governance and economic linkages. All of this was relevant before the criticality narrative emerged. It's even more so today when we know that criticality has so many dimensions of industrialization, of competition for access to resources, but also expectations that this is realized in a more responsible way with better benefit sharing. And I'm sure you've already also looked at the work of international organizations. So this is less state to state and more multilateral cooperation on key issues. The work that IGF Mining or the OECD did on responsibility in mineral operations, responsibility in the mineral value chain, taxation, correct allocation of financial benefits, even down to really technical issues like management of environmental and social impact assessments, or the focus on mine closure that IGF Mining developed. All of these are relevant beyond critical minerals. And more importantly, they are the bedrock on which we can hopefully do better and develop critical mineral value chains that, yes, respond to the competitive imperatives of industrial requirement, but also to the social expectations that these are more of a lever for benefits for communities, for mineral-rich countries, and frankly, for the world. We need to decarbonize mining and minerals, integrate it fully into more sustainable value chains. So the challenges are big. Collaboration is inherently needed to address them, but we shouldn't overlook the work that has been done. It's very relevant, and it's a part of shaping the future.
Thank you, Ludivine. Perhaps following up on this, I'd be curious to know from your experience, which role do partnerships between governments, industry, and local communities play to foster more sustainable and responsible raw materials extraction? Could you perhaps highlight some examples?
So I think it's quite clear that we have a whole series of new bilateral relationships around minerals in the context of the criticality agenda. Whether it's the EU shaping new strategic partnerships with a series of mineral-rich countries, or the US, for example, also entering into some wide arrangements to jointly support the emergence of responsible mineral value chains. But we, first of all, shouldn't overlook the fact that these are not the only players. Japan, Korea, and of course China, but also India and other actors in mineral value chains are reorganizing their foreign relations, their partnerships, their collaboration, their cooperation with mineral-rich countries. So it's a global trend, but at the same time, it's something that's at the moment quite emerging, and we're not seeing a very clear link from these partnerships to a radical shift in the paradigm of how we invest in minerals, how we conduct mineral operations, because fundamentally the market drivers remain essential. So how policy shapers, how cooperation features in that space is very much a work in progress. I think we also need to consider the need for more than bilateral cooperation. And there's one example there, which I'm not sure we can yet call a success, but I'm very much hopeful will deliver some innovative and purposeful outcomes. And that is the work that the Paris Peace Forum is doing on transition minerals. So what's interesting is that the whole approach is to really overcome the geopolitical tensions, the lack of international coordination, the fragmentation of the international institutions on issues about minerals and responsibility. And to do that by creating a real thought process about where we can foster collaborative solutions beyond the competition. I think it's a good way to reposition the issues that we face in minerals by understanding that fundamentally global problems without cooperative solutions lead to conflicts. And so I'm quite supportive of this initiative. The Paris Peace Forum has been focusing on transition minerals since 2022, and that resulted in the convening of a high-level Council for Responsible Transition Minerals in June 2024. The Council has a 2-year mandate to address and to propose a series of collaborative solutions on 5 key work streams, which include, as I said, the fragmentation of the multilateral approaches to minerals, but also the fundamental challenges in mineral markets, particularly when they're very opaque, the need to foster better opportunities for mineral-rich countries in terms of industrialization, long-term development, sustainable development, the need to finance responsible mining, which means knowing what's responsible and then aligning a much wider universe of financial options. And of course, at the heart of that is how to foster environmental and social performance all along the value chain. We can't take siloed approaches because value chains are fundamentally the way for us to think about our global impact across all industries, across all activities. So I'm hoping that this Council will deliver some really innovative proposals and solutions. I know that the UN panel, which is currently working, is also looking at how to foster better collaboration, better global cooperation on the issues around critical minerals. It's going to be, I think, a mix of bilateral conversations, new partnerships, new relationships, but also potentially reshaping the multilateral relationships so that together we can meet the challenges of climate change and fundamentally the environmental transition that's needed.
Thank you so much for your insightful answers. You already highlighted that collaboration is essential, but it comes with lots of challenges. And what are some of the key obstacles right now to the effective international cooperation in critical raw materials sector? And how can they be overcome?
Of course, if we focus specifically on critical minerals, the whole point of a mineral being deemed critical is that there is an element of supply risk. There is an element, a foundation of scarcity, which immediately leads us to a perspective of competition or even conflict. So by super focusing on the criticality narrative, which of course is important because it is linked to, societal choices on industry, on transition, it is key. But the problem is that by focusing only on the criticality narrative, it's very easy to really get pulled in to a hyper-competitive perspective. But the reality is, underneath the criticality narrative, the stakes are global. Climate change is not something that happens in a region. Even if one region miraculously could wave a magic wand and address its own impact on not just climate, but on biodiversity, on planetary balances and constraints, it wouldn't solve the problem because these are planetary limitations and constraints. So there's a choice here to be made. Do we fundamentally let the most competitive element of that narrative drive all of the positions? Or do we try to strike a balance between competition, which is useful, which is an important part of having innovation, of having change, but balanced with a real view of where we all need to convene together around solutions development, implementation, and the enabling ecosystem fundamentally, we could create the best solution in the world if we can't finance it, deploy it, ensure that it's socially acceptable. It's just a concept. It's something nice on paper. So I do think that the challenges are many. I think also some of these challenges are rooted in the fact that there is a legacy. There is a past. Minerals in particular have a strong legacy issue. There's words that are associated with mineral production, mineral transformation, which carry a heavy historical weight, from colonialist or extractivist approaches, to tensions between producers and users of minerals. So I think the challenges are not just in the reality of what we need to be doing. They're in the narratives, and they're even in all of the legacy issues, all of the unsaid, almost unheard, but present elements that drive some of our positions. Which means that to overcome these challenges, to foster a collaborative approach, we need to really dig within ourselves to accept the legacy, not be defensive, and to really look for the solutions that work. So, yeah, I think overcoming these challenges requires personal effort. It requires major societal choices, and it requires a lot of self-honesty about what the real problems are and how we solve them. That's not very easy in a world where, tensions abound. So yeah, I would definitely say that when we speak about overcoming challenges, perhaps the number one thing we can do is acknowledge the challenge and acknowledge where they start at home. So one of the issues, for example, that is not at all present in the narrative on criticality from most of the, big regions that are currently pushing a strong criticality agenda, like the US or the EU or even Japan and Korea, is the question of demand management. So demand management is a word that's been very much associated with degrowth or with a rejection of the industrial objectives that drive criticality in the mineral sector. I think maybe this is something we need to engage with a great deal more, because beyond demand management, there is a question of prioritization. What is key? What's essential? What's essential to a certain group, country, or region? Is it essential to another group, country, or region? And how do we strike new balances? So it sounds a little bit pie in the sky, but I do think that perhaps in the next few years, we will need collectively to rethink some of the criticality narrative with a clearer view as to where the priorities lie, but also where others' priorities lie. Mineral-rich countries, whether they are Finland or Malawi, all have objectives of leveraging mineral wealth for long-term benefits, of positioning strategically around their mineral wealth. These are legitimate concerns that need to be considered at every step of the conversation.
Thank you, Ludivine. There are obviously lots of differences between the legal and regulatory frameworks from one country to the other. According to you, how could countries better work together to harmonize regulations to ensure that the supply chains are not only efficient, but that they also become more environmentally and socially responsible?
I think I'm a lawyer initially. I think that having diversity of frameworks in and of itself is not a problem. I honestly believe that you hear a lot at the moment of concerns about the many layers of frameworks that mineral operators have to deal with. Could we perhaps streamline? Absolutely. Should we? Definitely. But diversity of regulatory frameworks are also a reflection of societal choices and priorities. And whilst we have global challenges, solutions exist at a local level. So I don't think that in and of itself, we need to absolutely harmonize to achieve interoperability and to be able to have sufficient transparency to work correctly. However, there's two things that I think are useful. The first one is beyond the regulatory frameworks of a country, there are a whole series of voluntary standards and frameworks that mineral operators can choose to adhere to. Is regulation the safest way to drive environmental and social performance? Probably. But where there are gaps, where regulation has not been able to follow up as quickly as we need to, or even better yet, to anticipate the requirements, voluntary standards can play a really useful role in bridging the gap. So I understand that there are concerns about voluntary standards or industry standards, sometimes from some of the stakeholders who perhaps don't trust these standards or think that there is an element of almost self-protection from one industrial group or another. I think we need to turn that idea on its head and look at voluntary standards as bridges to either push forward regulation or to perhaps facilitate, the linkages between the regulation of different countries. The other thing that I think is essential beyond regulatory frameworks is regulatory and supervisory capacity. You can have the best law in the world. If you don't have the administration, the people, the means, sometimes as simple as the financial resources to be able to supervise operators, to hold them to account, to monitor them even constructively, to be able to discuss with operators about concerns or questions, and together to solve whatever is coming up, then the law means nothing. Regulator capacity is what makes the difference between a space where environmental and social performance, where good governance, both on the corporate level and on the national level, are truly used to enable responsibility, and the spaces where it's not. Regulator capacity. That is also the key to, enabling responsible investment in responsibly operated projects. So let's look at the value of voluntary standards, even if we accept the fact that it is best for expectations to be set in regulation, because then they're part of a national contract, a societal agreement on what needs to happen. But let's also never forget that implementation comes down to regulators and their capacity to monitor and to intervene and to fundamentally be on a level playing field with operators.
Great perspective, thanks. You already endorsed the geopolitical and security aspects, both at national and regional levels. And considering that critical raw materials are often concentrated in specific regions, with geopolitical tensions. How can international cooperation help mitigate these tensions and ensure a fair and equitable distribution of resources?
I do think we may be sometimes overlooking what concentration is. So, all due respect to geology, concentration is very much a geographic issue. It's where the minerals are, and it starts with that. But the notion of concentration also closely links to control and to who decides how, where, and why things happen. So I do think that this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in how the Global Council that's being convened by the Paris Peace Forum will approach some of its work streams. Because if we think about concentration beyond the geographic to issues of control and issues of decision making, that means that we need to look at financing, because investment and financing is the enabler of operations. It also means that we need to look at markets, because particularly in critical minerals, particularly in those critical minerals which are very specialist, which are very small volumes with extremely opaque markets, where sometimes you don't have more than a dozen buyers worldwide, because that's how the market is structured. So we need to think about who's financing operations, how we can bring more responsible investment to emerging operations. And this isn't just mining. This is also processing. This is also all the steps of the value chain. And in order to look across the value chain, it means we also need to work on making some of the critical minerals markets more transparent, more fluid, more efficient. Are we going to be able to transform hyper specialist markets into, I don't know, the market that we have for copper, which is global, open, transparent, and extremely fluid? Absolutely not. But should we think about how perhaps we could collaborate more across borders, across regions, also between producer and user regions? Should we think together more about how we can make these markets more open, more transparent, more fluid, so that there's less of a very restricted level of control amongst very few hands? I think that would be one of the keys to unlocking the competition, to redistributing control over operations. And the same thing goes for financing. There is a lot of concern that we will go back to the bad old days and effectively apply very extractivist approaches, go to the places where minerals are concentrated, extract them, and then effectively they disappear into a global value chain, and the value that's created is captured very far away from where the minerals originated. If we want to rethink that, quite frankly, it can't be left up to policy, because policy shapers can agree, can foster investment, can encourage reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring. Fundamentally, it's fostering industrialization. But the reality is the market will decide ultimately where things should be, where they make sense, where and how minerals must be transformed into valuable product. So maybe we even need to think further, not just about the location of operations, but how we allocate the value that's created. There's industries where countries get paid not so much on the value of the minerals, the value of the product that comes out of their border, but they also have some connection further down value chains to more of the value that's created from transformation. I think maybe we need to get a little bit more creative about how we approach markets, how we make them more efficient, but also how we capture value and how we allocate that value between the different operators, investors, and the countries that, are to some extent also bearing the burden of these operations from an environmental perspective, a social perspective, trade perspective. But this requires big, complicated conversations. And I think we're just at the beginning of those conversations.
Thank you, Ludivine. I think we will need to close this podcast. Perhaps just one last question, connecting back a bit to the main theme of the CIRAN project and our podcast, which is how to reconcile resource extraction with nature conservation. So would you like to add anything on how international cooperation can contribute to develop strategies that can help to better manage the balance between these two societal needs?
I'm involved in a number of initiatives around this tension, and it is a tension. So you have a series of initiatives that focus, much as CIRAN is trying to unpack, on the status of certain places, of saying, well, where do we put the protection of nature and the ecosystems above human activity? But there's also a thought process about the role that each of these zones or areas plays in planetary systems. I'm discussing, for example, with one research project that's trying to unpack whether or not it would be useful to have no-go zones, where we determine that one ecosystem, one specific place has such an impact on the balances of biodiversity, climate, water across an entire region, maybe even on a global scale, that we should restrict human activity, and in that human activity, mining. I think what's important in that context is to accept that the prioritization will not be according to a universal principle. I think that each place, each ecosystem, but also each society that is the steward of that ecosystem is going to be making choices. So when we look at this from a collaboration and cooperation perspective, perhaps the best thing we can do is, first of all, create a space where we can discuss the value of certain areas, certain ecosystems, not just at their level or their geography, but also for the planetary systems, because that's something that is beyond countries or regions. And we don't have a space, I think, where we can have that conversation. And it might be important in the context of a local decision or a national decision to consider the global aspects in prioritization. The other thing I would say is also that, again, if we accept that we need to prioritize protection and or activity, human activity, including mining and mineral activity, then I think this leads us to think of what is the justification for both. And in the case of human activity, I do think that we need to be perhaps more credible about the real drivers of criticality. And not every mineral use is critical. Not every mineral use, frankly, deserves the same level of prioritization as another. And that's a conversation that we struggle to have because we view it as something that's against minerals. I think we could have that conversation not as being against minerals, but out of respect for the minerals, the ecosystems from which we extract them, the impact on those ecosystems, whether they're natural, physical, or social. And also, the value of what we are trying to achieve, the difficult work of extracting and processing minerals.
I was appreciating your perspective of passing from regional to planetary perspective.
Yes. It all hinges on this notion of no-go zone. And I think if you start by saying no-go zone, some people stop listening. I think we need to find a better way to think about not doing something or doing something. And prioritization is probably a more useful concept than saying, we can't do it, we won't do it, we decide not to. No, we may decide not to because of. So we accept the fundamental balancing act of what we are doing, which is part of accountability as well.
Fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you so much.
This episode was brought to you by CIRAN. CIRAN is an EU-funded project that is investigating how to balance resource extraction and nature conservation.